Welcome. I'm Chris Coven. I'm the founder of In the House, and this is our monthly cybersecurity and privacy webcast, which is co-hosted with David Heckler, who's the editor and publisher of the Tag Cyber Law Journal. And we're delighted to have today Stewart Baker, who is a real pioneer and expert in the field of cybersecurity law. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to turn it right over to David, and he can introduce Stewart properly and we can get started. Feel free to ask questions. We are recording this session and it will be available afterwards, hopefully tomorrow, on our website, which is at www.inthehouse.org. So I'll turn it over to David now.
Thanks. Chris, we'll also have a very long interview I did with Stewart last year. That'll be posted on the same page next to the video. It was so long that, I could not, in good conscience, cut it. So I just broke it into two parts, which I don't think I'd done before, and I don't think I've done since. So it's a credit to you that you had a lot to say, and it was the kind of things that I thought people needed to hear. So Stewart is actually kind of four people in one here. He's a corporate security advisor to his clients. He's a partner, longtime partner at Steptoe. He kind of steps in and steps out of Steptoe because he's also worked for the government. He was he was an NSA general counsel in the early 1990s. And then when DHS, when the Department of Homeland Security was founded, he was I think the first lawyer hired to craft public policy rules. And actually his deputy, I didn't know this until I interviewed Paul Rosenzweig, who we had on here maybe 3 months ago. And he was Stewart's deputy at the time. And he's still, you guys are still talking all the time because I've seen him on your podcast. I haven't seen him, I've heard him on your podcast. And that's another area that you function in. You're not just a government veteran and a corporate security advisor, but you're a national security expert who hosts this podcast, and you're always talking about government policy and debating all the issues, some of which you first dealt with literally decades ago. And you're kind of, in that respect, what I think of as a cybersecurity historian, because you bring a sense of the history of where it all started. In fact, when we talked, you brought it back to World War II, and you were a clerk for John Paul Stevens, may he rest in peace, and he had actually gotten his start in this field when during World War II. Anyway, without going back farther than that now, I've got some questions that I was going to ask you that started us in the present tense, but Richard, who was on a few minutes early and had met you before, started a discussion that I don't want to get in the way of. So Richard, I turn the mic over to you. Why don't you kind of, for the benefit of the people who joined us since that little conversation, tell us some of the questions you wanted to ask Stewart, and then we'll carry on from there.
Okay, well, I think the threshold question is, in terms of cybersecurity, how bad is it? Because I think we're in a crisis headed for catastrophe. But I share this view with some of my lawyer friends and some of my technical friends. I guess the other thing I need to explain is I'm a computer scientist by choice and a lawyer by accident. I was a computer scientist for the Air Force, for the U.S. government, and then they sent me to law school. And now I find my two career fields colliding together in the world of cybersecurity. So I serve today as a GC and a CIO of a small company, and so I meet with both groups. And when I meet with the legal people, they say, yes, we're providing legal guidance on cybersecurity, data privacy, and all of this to their clients. And then I meet with my IT CIOs and CISOs, and they say, absolutely not. Either we get nothing, or we get the ultimate conservative viewpoint, which means lock up the data, don't let anybody use it, the business can't continue. So that doesn't work. But then I recently have spoken to two other technicians, and one of them called it the cyber Armageddon that we're in, because we and then this week I met another technician. What I'm getting to is the technicians see that we're over relying on computers. We're replacing people with computers that in places where they shouldn't be. The hype about AI is oversold. The blockchain is also oversold. And as technicians, we're waiting. And then, of course, you have the U car that ran over people and the two 737s that crashed. And so, as technicians, as computer scientists, we're saying, wait a minute, software is just not that reliable yet. And you cannot replace, in certain places, people with technology. And then that's the usage. The other dimension is the cybersecurity. The intruders are getting in, they're stealing, and then they're immune because they're offshore. There's nothing you can do about them. The internet is international, but the ultimate criminals are not being prosecuted, but their intermediate victims, Target, Home Depot, or the other breaches, they've had to pay. And so where's the deterrence? How are we going to stop this? So taken together, all of these factors, this is where I'm concerned that we're in a crisis headed for catastrophe. The businesses are not defending properly. The legal system's not providing remedies. And so my question to Stewart is, coming from the government, particularly from NSA, which I believe is a very respectable organization. What can the government do, and how much have they been damaged by Snowden and others, and what could they do to detect and respond to protect our cybersecurity interests? And I'll stop.
Okay. Well, that's a big set of questions. I think we are still in a serious mess, and cyber Armageddon is maybe the more likely outcome of all of this. I just was walking through the Cyber Solarium report, which is worth downloading if you get a chance. That's solar power IUM, just finished this week. And the introduction was written by a guy whom I've interviewed and will interview again on the Cyber Law podcast, because he manages to write Tom Clancy novels that are also policy documents. And so he's written a fascinating and pretty good, just pretty good, thriller about China's ability to invade Hawaii and take it over, and then the way in which they did it without actually using core military power, and then what the fight was like. And it was meant to illustrate the state of actual war fighting technology. He's just finished another book that is about artificial intelligence, and they called on him to write the introduction. So there's a 2-page science fiction introduction to the Solarium report that is pretty much cyber Armageddon. I think we did go down some wrong roads here. The assumption that engineers made, because they're engineers, was that we could engineer our way out of this problem, that attackers were exploiting bugs. All programs have bugs. All program bugs get fixed, and the programs end up running. So why don't we just fix the bugs? That'll lock the bad guys out and we'll be done. And we're realizing now that the bugs are probably infinite. And even if the bugs aren't infinite, we are constantly expanding the attack surface. Once we've locked down our computer networks, we all go out and get smartphones. And when we've locked down the smartphones, if ever, we'll all have Internet of Things devices all over our homes. So it does seem as though we are constantly saying, oh, well, okay, attack me again in a new way. And so I'm of the view that the engineers are not fully solving this problem. I am completely with the engineers, though, when they say they aren't getting good advice from the lawyers. I think that is a real problem. Lawyers are in the business of giving advice about how, minimal compliance. What's the minimum I can do to get a check mark on you have complied with this requirement? And the one thing that is clear, and I think everybody agrees on who studies this, is that a compliance focus will never solve this problem. You have to believe I have an enemy, and my job is to stop my enemy. If he succeeds, the fact that I was in compliance won't matter. I need to always be asking, what's my enemy doing now, and how do I stop that? Now, I have to say, in some ways, lawyers are built for this job. Especially in-house counsel, almost every company with an in-house counsel also has institutional adversaries, people who basically you think are in business to stop you from achieving the goals that you have as a business, whether it's the plaintiff's bar or some regulator. There's always somebody that you think of as the adversary. And thinking of ways to stop the adversary is what a good lawyer does. And thinking about ways to stop the cyber adversary is something that CISOs should be doing, and that lawyers should be encouraging them to do. Asking them, who's my enemy? What do they want to do to me? What tools are they going to use? How do I block those tools? If you can answer those questions, then you're going to have more cybersecurity. Last point on this, I have begun to run into people that I respect in this area who will say this problem can be solved, and indeed has been solved by actual companies in the wild. That is to say, it is possible to lock the bad guys out if you do, or if not lock them out, to evict them promptly upon them getting in. And part of it is you have to spend a lot of money. And the other part, and this is maybe more important, you have to be willing to take on a bunch of costs that in many ways are more expensive than money. You need to be able to say, I will stop having certain capabilities. My CEO will not be able to work from the beach cottage this weekend. Telling the CEO that can be career limiting. But the idea that you give the CISO the authority to say, this is going to be really inconvenient, but it's necessary for security, and therefore we're going to implement it. The CEO is going to have to learn to use one of those little keys, and he can't get mad and fire somebody because the keys aren't working because he doesn't understand how to make them work. He's got to learn, because that's the only way you're going to have cybersecurity on the network. And that kind of empowerment, one of the guys told me a story about a company that finally said, we're just not going to take credit cards because there's so much fraud. In certain circumstances, you just cannot buy our services with a credit card as a way of ending their cyber fraud, and it worked. So there are mechanisms, there are best practices here, there are people who are winning this fight. I've heard this from Dick Clark, I've heard this from Dmitry Alperovich. These are people who understand what's going on, and that's the one bit of good news, that they may be right. It may be possible to do. I guess I should say, you asked about the government. The government is not one of those institutions. The government is, if anything, more hidebound. There are more things that you simply cannot get government to do because the walls haven't been broken down. You can't get government to allow your CISO to inspect attackers wherever they may be in the network, because some of them are in the agriculture department's network, some of them are in the interior department's network, and the agriculture department and the interior department are not going to let anybody from the other department into their network. So there are still lots of problems with government's ability to do cybersecurity. NSA, they're terrific. They're really talented. They still have some of these problems for sure, but they are as good at security as anybody I know. Unfortunately, as with everybody in this field, they don't have the kind of institutional authority that you would really need to ensure that you've locked down your network the way it needs to be locked down. And so I might take advice from them. I would not imitate them.
So Stuart, quick follow-up. You mentioned something very intriguing, which is that lawyers are well equipped to deal with serious, well-funded, and determined adversaries. I guess in this circumstance, the adversaries are, A, anonymous, B, often extraterritorial, and C, unbound by any rules of ethics or law. Which I think is different from most adversaries lawyers deal with, right? The government is limited, hopefully, and as are plaintiffs' lawyers, hopefully. So doesn't this make this a unique adversary? And also, assuming that lawyers maybe aren't equipped to do this on their own, who are their allies? Who can they, if they can't reach out to the government, who can they reach out to help them deal with this kind of new type of adversary?
So it is true that they are all those things you said. They are largely anonymous, largely offshore, largely immune from legal process. They're not immune from being identified. Their anonymity is more fragile than one might think. And the U.S. government has demonstrated over and over again that even if you're the Russian GRU working directly for Putin, your identity can be pulled out of your attack network. The same is true for the People's Liberation Army officers who've launched attacks on us, and for the GRU folks who were interfering with the election. They've all been indicted. Now, being indicted and going to jail are two very different things. But what the government showed with those indictments is we know who you are, we can find you, you are never going to Disney World. Or at least you're not going to stay. And so that's identification is one thing. Second thing is, can you reach them? And often you can. You can freeze their accounts in ways that actually have meaning, because every bank in the world that has a correspondent relationship with a New York bank has to worry, if it's told you cannot do business with this particular hacker, it will freeze his accounts, even if it doesn't actually do any business directly in the United States. And that could be a real problem for some of the attackers. So you can reach these guys. The rules, the lack of rules, this is a question of how aggressively the United States can respond to things that we believe violate the rules that we would apply. I've been a strong proponent that we need more aggressive responses because, as the current head of NSA said in a hearing when asked about the Russians and the Chinese and what they were doing, he said, well, they don't fear us. And frankly, they need to fear us.
I'm going to jump in here for a second just to say I was at a conference on ransomware last week, and a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Pittsburgh talked about some success they've had at actually getting defendants extradited, and where that wasn't possible, convincing local authorities to prosecute based on all the evidence that they had put together and working. They flew out to Bulgaria, sat down with the local prosecutors and made a case, and and one conviction. So it's not impossible. It's a very small percentage, but
you don't have to. It's interesting. Somebody once did a study. This was a few years ago, and he came to the conclusion there were probably only 200 people developing the core tools that were being used by criminal hackers to run ransomware or to break into systems. So you only have to discourage 200 people from doing this by persuading them that they're better off doing something else. Now Bulgaria is it's part of the European Union, so it's an easier sell than Ukraine, for example.
Yes.
But yeah, we can reach many of them, and we can't reach Chinese hackers. We can't reach Russian hackers. But those folks are, at least in part, subject to government control. And so if we can persuade the governments that it's not in their interest for these guys to be carrying out attacks, we're down to the Iranians and the North Koreans.
Now, before we get too deeply into international affairs, what are some of the things that your clients are dealing with on a regular basis that they want your help on? If we can just sort of bring it down to the corporate level, what kinds of things?
So for sure, breaches, notification of breaches, that's there's a lot, there's 50 plus jurisdictions that regulate breach notification, and bringing all of those rules together and providing the notification and then telling the Defense Department within 72 hours and telling the European Union promptly it's just a kind of massive, it's a piece of machinery you have to crank, and you got to crank it fast. So that is one problem that they face pretty regularly. I have some clients who do research on the darknet. They have a group of people who have established their bona fides in criminal circles and who use those bona fides to find evidence of new credit card exploits that people have pulled off, so they can notify the folks who are at risk or who've lost their cards and been breached. That's become a little easier. The Justice Department just released a study or a white paper on where the risk is if you run that kind of a business. And I would say they couldn't quite overcome their inherent conservative prosecutorial bent, which is just to keep all the prosecutorial options open. But they made a good faith effort, and so they did clarify some things. I'm not sure it's comforting at the end of the day, but it was a big step forward to get them to do that. CCPA compliance, California Consumer Privacy Act compliance, has been a major effort for everybody who worries about this. Most people who are dealing with CCPA dealt with GDPR the year before, so it's not an unknown exercise, and by and large, all the things you did for GDPR will stand you in good stead for CCPA, but it is still different enough and the rules are vague enough that there's a lot of uncertainty, and probably will be for quite a while as the regs get written and then litigated and the like. We're still waiting to see the flood of litigation. Probably won't come till later this year as people fail to meet the plaintiff's bar's expectations. So those are probably the things. Oh, and I have a practice for technology companies that involves export controls. What can you sell outside the United States? That has, and also a practice about CFIUS, which is when you sell a company, get bought. Increasingly, the law's been changed. I used to run this program when I was at DHS. I was the principal CFIUS hawk at the time, saying we can't let the Chinese or the Israelis or the Russians buy this company. And that the hawks are running the show now, and they've gotten new legislation that gives them much greater authority. And one of the things that's happening is anybody who has data about Americans is probably not going to have an exit from their startup status that involves Chinese money. The government has made it clear that even transactions that are 2 years old that weren't approved or even a few that were approved, they're saying, no, we've decided we do not want the Chinese government to have access to data about Americans. And if that means that TikTok has to get rid of its US property, well, they're going to have to get rid of their US property. Or if Grindr, which I have to say is the last, this is basically a dating service for gay people, and it's owned by a Chinese company. You know, you would think that people would say, you know, I'm not sure I really want the Chinese to know my sexual preferences, you know, down to the particular acts and the HIV status that I have. But that's the current situation, and the government is basically saying, no, Grindr is going to have to get sold off because we don't want the Chinese to have that. So that's a tour of the kinds of stuff I'm doing.
That's quite a range.
Yeah.
Let's open the mics, Chris, and see if anybody wants to jump in with a question. You can, of course, still take your cursor, your mouse down to the chat function at the bottom, the icon, and write a question if you so choose. But
and speaking of the chat window, I did post a link to our prior webcast, which David mentioned, and I posted a link where you can get the Cyberspace Solarium report. So open up your chat window to at least get those links. And then, as David suggests, I'm going to unmute all, at least briefly, so people that don't know how to unmute themselves can ask questions. So let's give that a try right now.
Stuart, this is Scott Glick here. It's been about 4 years since I think we've seen each other. I'm now the general counsel of a company that does terrorism training and exercises for government. The question I have for you, I think the last time we had been speaking with each other, the government had passed the Cybersecurity Act, which allowed classified threat indicators to be shared with private sector companies through the appropriate procedures. Do you have any sense of whether that's been effective, and if not, why it hasn't been effective?
I'm just going to briefly remute because there is some background noise, so we can unmute again. Let me unmute you.
In the chat room, I put my my podcast feed for those of you who are interested. So information sharing has been something people have talked about for 20 years, or at least 15. There were some restrictions that, or at least legal worries that the private sector had about sharing the information. I've always thought that, and this act did push those to the side mostly. I thought that the real problem was people weren't sure what value they were getting from the government, and I fear that's still true. The government only has a very limited amount of unique information, and once they provide it to one or two companies, the forensics cybersecurity companies scarf that up and fold it into the offerings they have. So it would be easy for people to say, well, I don't see a lot new in my dealings with the government. I do think we're going to see more of this in a more effective way as some of the ISACs, especially the financial services ISAC, really integrate their sharing of information among themselves. There's much more value in the sharing between companies than uniquely from the government, but the government can help foster that. And that information, increasingly, you can do it in real time. There's software that allows you to do it. There's software that allows you to say, here's what I just experienced. And then you ask the software, is there anybody who's posted something like that? So that we can immediately set up a share a relationship, and I can get the benefit of what they've already learned. So I think sharing is going to happen, but it has been remarkably slow. People have been sending out, basically pasting all of their cybersecurity information, all the bad IP addresses and email addresses that they've found, into spreadsheets and sending them in, and other people have been cutting and pasting them into their own. And that's just, it's so labor intensive and slow that it hasn't paid off the way I would like it to. But I think as we start making it something that you can actually do in real time, mediated by software, I've seen or I've heard from people that it is starting to be more of a payoff.
Yeah, we
That's
did have.
because the promise was, or at least the desire, that if you had the private sector had security clearances, the government would be passing their classified threat indicators, and that would have or was hoped to have a profound effect. So it's interesting that hasn't really, 4 or 5 years later, hasn't proved to be the case.
They do that. They do provide a lot of classified briefings. I have always, I once described in the 90s, early 90s, what I thought happened to prosecutors when they came out to NSA and they had a case that was adjacent to a national security problem. And they knew what the National Security Agency could do, the amount of information it could scarf up. And they knew there was stuff, the good stuff was being withheld from them because they didn't have the clearance. They demand the clearance, they demand access to all the data. And finally, we kept saying, "Oh, I'm not sure it's going to work out for you." And they'd say, "Oh, you're just trying to protect your data irrationally." So we give them access and we put them in a room with all the potentially relevant signals intelligence. And they come out about 3 days later, glazed over. They've been doing nothing but read intelligence. And all of it is kind of sort of relevant, but it's not written for them. It wasn't collected for them. And so it doesn't tell them what they wanted to know. And this is the real problem with intelligence sharing with the private sector. You only get good intelligence if you have a good customer who demands intelligence that is directly relevant to his problem. And so until you recognize the private sector as your customer and you say, "Here's what I've got," and you let them tell you what's good and what's not, and you go back and you collect something that's a little better, and they say, "Oh, that's a little better, but you still missed this important thing. Why don't you look for this?" That's how you get good intelligence, and we still don't have that kind of relationship.
I got to comment, that sounds like a very similar problem that a lot of us lawyers have suffered over the last 20 years in litigations in the e-discovery world, trying to sort through a mass of e-documents and finding the relatively few relevant documents in the litigation context. That maybe some of the same AI that people are developing for that could be used for the looking through intelligence and looking for cybersecurity signals. I don't know if anyone's working on that, but
the thing that I think NSA can do more of and the government can do more of is they can say, "You tell us what you found inside your network. Tell us the indicators of who this might be," because there's a lot of tells in the data. And then we can go out and find these guys where they think they're safe outside the United States. We can extract attribution information and we can look for ways to impose penalties. Right now, that's not something that the private sector can do, and it will be a while before it can do something like that. So if you integrate well and can share the information about an ongoing attack with the government, and the government is sufficiently motivated to start looking immediately for where those attackers are, trying to interfere with their ability to pull the data home, and then impose sanctions on them. The Pittsburgh U.S. Attorney's Office is the best in the country at this, and they've done that working with the FBI and NSA pretty effectively for some big companies.
So speaking of Pittsburgh, we had on an earlier webcast, Matt Lavinia, who runs the NCFTA, the National Cyber Forensic Training Center in Pittsburgh, headquartered in Pittsburgh. They have satellite offices in New York and LA now. And that's, they are an opportunity, they provide an opportunity for companies to share information and for them to be embedded in a big room with FBI, Secret Service, all the other related DHS related agencies to work together. and it seems to be accomplishing something, but it's not public. I mean, very few people know it exists. We had Matt Lavinia come on, he talked about it, but it's all under the auspices of confidentiality, so that, I mean, that obviously makes it work because companies are sharing information with each other, the government, and they are working together to get to know each other. That makes a lot of sense, but you don't see, that replica. You don't see replicas of that model, probably partly because A, people don't know about it, and then B, people can't see the real benefit because it's all in that room. It's all
Yeah.
kept in that room.
Although I will say, the guys in that room, they will be working for CISOs all over the country in 5 years. And so there is a spread, and there is a residual trust that has developed as we've developed this massive private sector industry that does cybersecurity and forensics. And that trust enables a lot more sharing of information than we used to see.
Well, historically, I think it's probably correct to say that cars weren't really that safe until Nader's raiders and the plaintiffs bar got active. So maybe that flood of litigation you're anticipating, Stewart, will force companies to figure out whatever resources they can to fix some of these problems. Although, as you pointed out, complying with the rules doesn't necessarily guarantee a safe cyber environment. So,
and complying with rules that you think some judge who's 68 years old might think are reasonable 5 years from now, that's a not likely to be a cutting edge solution.
Very good point. So should we unmute again, David, and see,
Yeah.
we've gotten a couple good questions now. So
Sure.
let me unmute again, and then I'll remute probably if we still have background noise. So does anyone else have a question for Stewart Baker? We still have about 10 minutes left. So Victor Lee, yes.
Sure. Hi, Stewart. Thanks. Great comments. So I'd like to go back to the nation state question with regard to cybersecurity, kind of in two flavors, right? Number one is that nation states seem to be able to get away with things in the cyber realm that you couldn't do in the physical realm. Something like Russia and Ukraine, right? If you bomb the grid, that's a war. If you attack the grid through cyber, that's not a war. That's not an act of war somehow. So that's question number one. Question number two regarding the private sector is when nation states go after individual companies like North Korea and Sony, right? So
Yeah.
we don't expect Sony to stop Russian tanks, but are they on their own, when it comes to cyber attacks from other governments?
Great comments.
So
Stuart, just let me remute quickly. Sorry. We're having a big, here we go. Now you're unmuted, Stuart. Sorry.
So let me start with the Sony, because I think that we've learned a lot. We learned a lot from that. It was a surprise that an attack on a company by a nation state to extract some concession would occur, but it has happened elsewhere. The Iranians attacked the Sands Las Vegas casinos because their owner, Sheldon Adelson, who's an enormous backer of Israel, suggested the United States ought to conduct a couple of nuclear tests in the Iranian desert as a way of demonstrating resolve. And the Iranians took offense, not surprisingly, but they bricked many of the machines inside his casino. We didn't do anything about that, partly because he probably didn't want to ask the Obama administration for help. But we have not all the consequences that fell on the North Koreans were made public. They did suffer some consequences. I have pitched that we should have done much more to provide more creative consequences and more aggressive ones. My two favorite suggestions for irresponsible but surprising and potentially effective responses is one, I said, why don't we take that movie, that stupid movie, The Interview? We could probably put it on a thumb drive or a card that you could put into a phone, we could put 1 million of them on little SIM cards, attach the SIM cards to helium balloons, and release them upwind of China, of North Korea. And just let, you know, he did this to make sure that movie was never shown. We would make sure that everybody in North Korea saw it. That would probably deny him the fruits. And if it was done by the US government rather than Sony, attacking Sony wouldn't help. The other idea that I think we really should think seriously about is North Korea, it has lousy internet connectivity. And just like somebody who has bad connectivity at home, so he goes to the local Starbucks, North Korea sends its hackers to places like Malaysia and East Africa, and they move into hotels and they hack us from there. I said, well, you know, why don't we just have special forces drop from the sky, take over the hotel, you know, arrest everybody that we don't shoot, and put them on a plane to the United States, and then give them the choice of working for us or going to jail. This would certainly put a crimp in the North Korean style. They are making a lot of money. They are making hundreds of millions of dollars a year with stealing Bitcoin, and this is what they're doing now. They've given up on attacking Sony, but they really are prospering in terms of Bitcoin heists. And you know, the U.S. government has found a way to start tracking those Bitcoins and preventing the Bitcoin from actually getting into the market. And they're going to be more effective at that over time. So there, again, it's possible to impose consequences. It just takes a while. As for, is it an act of war, and are nation states getting away with stuff that they shouldn't be getting away with because they're doing it in cyberspace? Let's remember, you know, Russia invaded Ukraine. They just said, you know, Crimea, that's ours. We're just moving in. And they had a soft invasion of eastern Ukraine. And there's still a hot war going on there. And they're not paying a price for that either. So their attack on the grid was just one of the violations of what's normally understood as international law that they are getting away. I am, you know, what they have done in Ukraine is bad. They've done stuff that's very similar to that, right up to the point of actually using it in our grid. They've installed the tools that are necessary to pull off a Ukraine-style hack, and that hack was a lot worse than it failed.
Nancy, could you stop what you're doing?
Yeah, Nancy, please mute yourself because you're making a lot of background noise. Apologies for calling you out.
Sorry.
But if you can't make yourself heard verbally, then you could type something in the chat window.
Anyway, we face the problem of what do we do about Putin and his willingness to take risks. There's a great book called Sandworm about what the GRU is doing, but they are totally empowered by Putin, who just, you know, he was never a really great spy, but he loves spy stories, and he loves it when his spies come in and tell him that they've done something shocking. And so they are completely empowered. I think we are going to have to do something worse than we've done to him to persuade him that this is not a good idea. And again, you know, I have this long list of shocking things that we should have on our list of retaliatory options designed to persuade the Russians that maybe we're not the soft touch we look like. And my suggestion there was apparently you can build an EMP device which actually fries all of the power for, you know, 5-10 miles around. You can build one, you know, something the size of a large copier. And so just as the Russians have put their software in our grid but haven't used it, maybe we should just ship a whole bunch of EMP devices to Moscow and St. Petersburg and just store them there capable of being turned on as necessary, and let the Russians find a few of them. Not all of them, but some of them.
It's
Uh,
it's like mutually assured destruction, cybersecurity edition, right? So interesting. Can I ask an even, so Victor had a great question. I have sort of a very fundamental and related question. So when we think of government, right, we all, I think of a traditional role of the government in the physical world
yeah.
is to keep us safe from enemies and criminals, foreign and domestic. So
Right.
do we need a shift in our fundamental thinking about cyberspace? Why is it not also a proper function of government to keep, not just to regulate the conduct of domestic actors, but to keep domestic actors safe from cyber threats, foreign and domestic? What do you think
So
about that?
it's a great analogy. I think it doesn't completely work, because in the physical world, we can have troops and police on the ground, on our streets, at our borders, and if necessary, they'll fight here. We do not, most of us, want to invite the government into our networks to inspect traffic that's coming across the border. We don't want them fighting with attackers on that network. And besides, they don't understand the network. So we don't want to teach them about our network and our problems in advance of this. So they end up locked out until we say, hey, I have a problem in my network, which is why I talked about the idea of interacting at that border where you know you have a problem, you've got somebody in and you want to respond appropriately, and then you ask the government for help. So that's, to my mind, the biggest problem. We just don't have an ability to get the government as engaged as we would in physical space.
And I suppose it's also worth noting that we don't really know very much about what goes on. That is, our government doesn't advertise all the things that it's doing. It doesn't advertise what it's stopping. So a lot of this is done in the dark, right?
True.
Yeah.
And you know, the Cyber Command has talked about how they are trying to defend forward, which basically means they want to be in the attacker's network while the attacker is planning the attack, so that they can see how to stop it. And they, you know, they're very good at that. We had video of some of the 2016 election attacks in the GRU's operations center. So it was, you know, we're not without options here, but using those capabilities just to attack raises the problem that somebody has described as, well, the US really probably has some of the best rocks, but we also have some of the glassiest houses.
Well, we have just a minute, but David Sanger, in his most recent book, talked about how the Obama administration never made even discussions about what we should be doing public, so that they didn't invite in commentary like yours, and they were very tight-lipped about everything. What do you think? I mean, I understand some of the constraints. You were at the NSA. You understand better than any of us. How public can this discussion be, and should it be?
I think we can be more public, because, especially about what we know about our adversaries, because we steal this stuff from their networks, and we've demonstrated, everybody has demonstrated, that knowing somebody is in your network stealing stuff doesn't mean you can stop them. And so if all we reveal is we stole this from inside the GRU's network, we haven't necessarily wrecked our sources and methods. And at this stage, being able to show what we know is the first stage. But if we just do that, it's more weakness than strength, because we have to also show we can cause pain to the people we've identified. If we haven't caused pain, then naming and shaming them in the end is a confession of weakness.
Great. So I think we are just about out of time. This was an incredible discussion. Stewart, thank you so much for your time. Just in closing, in addition to thanking you, I want to remind people that we will have the video of this webcast on our website, www.inthehouse.org. We also meet every single Friday for what we call GC Casual Fridays. Those sessions are held at noon U.S. Eastern Time. So all general counsel and other in-house counsel are welcome to join us. It's actually at the same Zoom video link. Last week, we talked about these sort of substantive issues going on with the COVID-19 virus. And tomorrow, we'll be talking about the impact on us personally and professionally, and sharing tips and suggestions for how to get through this together. And general counsel, just like others, are struggling through the personal and professional impacts of the virus. So I encourage you all to tune in. And I personally think that a big part of getting through this is technology. So I love video conferencing as an alternative to in-person meetings where it's either inconvenient or perhaps unsafe to get together in groups. So I encourage you all to join us then. And just want to thank Stewart and thank my co-host David Heckler. And I will end the recording here unless
Wait,
David has one
I
last
do.
thing.
I want to just make a plug for our next meeting, which is actually going to be early on April 2nd, because we are going to have someone talk about how to work remotely in a cybersecurely safe way. As more of us are doing, or are going to find out we're doing very soon, you know, remote work can be very convenient, but it's not always safe. And there are lots of vulnerabilities, especially when it's at length that you're going to be working remotely. So we've got someone who wrote an article and we just published it today, and he's going to come on and talk to us on April 2nd, the first Thursday of the month.
April 2nd, the first Thursday of next month, and it will be at noon. We'll be back at our
Back at
usual
noon.
time of noon. So thank you so much to everyone who participated.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Stewart.
Stewart. I'm going to stop the recording now, and hope to see you all next time.